Good morning. It's great to see you here and also there. And we really are thrilled to welcome Lee back again from Lancaster Theological Seminary. He's done a wonderful job the last couple of weeks informing us about our faith and just giving us a little more information about why we're here and what we believe as Presbyterians, and we really appreciate that. And thank you for being here.
Well, thank you. And I'm grateful that you folk could brave the cold and turn up. That's no mean feat. This is the last in the series of what makes Presbyterian theology, which is a branch of Reformed theology, what makes it unique, and therefore what makes Presbyterians different from other kinds of Christians. And we've looked at the understanding of God, we've looked at the understanding of salvation, and today we're going to cover everything else. And last time, somebody mentioned the crucial word predestination, election. Because if you ask folk on the streets what's different about Presbyterians, 9 times out of 10, they'll say predestination, if they know anything about Presbyterianism. And that is, in a way, a little misleading, but there's something to it. So we're going to look at what's technically called the doctrine of election, which is the notion that in matters of salvation, whether you will spend eternity in an intimate relationship with God, the agency, the action is all on God's part. That salvation is entirely a gift to which we contribute nothing. That makes Presbyterianism different from Methodism, for example, where the notion is that God makes the first move and offers us grace, but we have to make the second move and accept it. It's sort of like a package arrives at your door, you hear the doorbell, but you've got to open the door and sign for the delivery. That's Methodism. And a lot of the Baptist and evangelical traditions too. Presbyterians have historically thought, well, that gives people too much power. And that means if you end up in a right relationship with God, you can give yourself a pat on the back and say, well, God did part of it, but I did the rest. And I want some credit for that. And that could lead to smugness, self-righteousness, which historically Presbyterians have sought to avoid, because all the glory, all the praise, all the thanks, all the gratitude should go to God and not yourself. General rule of the thumb for Reformed theology is it's about God, it's not about you. But historically, that notion that it's all due to God's grace and God's love for us, for which we should give thanks, led to the notion, well, what about the folk who don't seem to have a relationship with God? Does that mean that God did not reach out to them, that God did not give them grace, that God does not love them? And to tell the truth, for part of the history of Presbyterianism, the answer was yes. God gives grace to some people and not to others. Not because God foresaw what they would do, thought that God has a crystal ball and looked like, well, some people will deserve grace and others won't. It's just God chose some and not others. And that was, to tell the truth, a Presbyterian doctrine. It's embedded in the Westminster Confession and other constitutional documents. But that sounds mean. It also sounds arbitrary on the part of God. So as we'll see, that notion has changed over the decades. We might ask, well, why did Presbyterians or Reformed people in general want to give all the credit to God in the first place and think that God was the solitary sole source of our salvation and everything else? Well, the answer probably goes back to the life of John Calvin. The founders of every form of Christianity have left their mark on the traditions they started. Martin Luther was riddled with guilt, and he created a form of Christianity, Lutheranism, that focuses on guilt and forgiveness. John Calvin had guilt problems too, but even more than that, he had a problem with something else. He, of course, lived in the early to mid 16th century. He started life out as the son of a good Catholic family. His father actually was sort of the accountant for the local bishop in northwestern France, in Picardy. His mother died when he was about 2 or 3. And then his father had trouble raising him and farmed him out to a variety of foster families who were responsible for educating him, mostly families of the nobility, who would take him in, feed him, house him, make sure he was getting educated, then get tired of him and send him somewhere else. So he spent his life sort of in different foster families, which for him was very chaotic and unsettling. He didn't feel secure. And then when he was mature and he showed that he was intellectually gifted, his father decided to send him to a Catholic seminary in Paris. Because if you were smart, that's what you did. So Calvin went to a seminary in Paris. And then the wars of religion started. The Protestant Reformation was underway. And it looked like it might be dangerous to become a priest. It might be dangerous to have a religious vocation if Protestants and Catholics were killing each other. So then Calvin's father pulled him out of seminary and sent him to law school, which was sort of unsettling again. But then it looked like the wars were dying down and there was going to be religious peace. So then Calvin's father took him out of law school and sent him back to seminary. And that happened a couple of times. So you can see a lot of chaos in Calvin's life. He didn't know if he was going to be a lawyer or be a priest. He had an unsettled, itinerant childhood. And then he discovered that he had Protestant leanings, so which he began to publicize. And France was still Catholic and not a very hospitable place. So he got out of France and became an itinerant writer of theology, going from one center of Protestantism to another, living on the charity of the Protestant nobility, who would house him, feed him, let him write, make sure he had some books, until they got tired of him, and they'd send him somewhere else. So he wandered around southern Germany, Switzerland, northern Italy, which at that time there were a lot of Protestants. Again, having no fixed abode, having a fairly chaotic and uncertain life. And then he was passing through Geneva in Switzerland, which had just undergone a Reformation, had just become Protestant. The Protestant minister in Geneva heard that this guy, Calvin, who was a Protestant and was theologically learned, was passing through, and interviewed him and said, I would like you to stay here and be my assistant in this reform of Geneva. And Calvin said, no, I don't like this. I'm French. I'm not Swiss. I don't like anything that seems to be chaotic. This city is a mess. In fact, I don't like the Alps because they're chaotic. He said that the Alps poke through the sky and blur the distinction between earth and heaven. You can't see where they end because of the clouds. And he thought that's just not right. That's chaotic. And he said the churches in Geneva had too many windows. Windows, he said, were a bad thing because they're chaotic, because they let the outside in and the inside out, and that's no good. And that there were too many people wearing strange clothing. There was a fashion revolution going on then, and he thought that was chaotic. that some men were dressing like women and women dressing like men. That's chaotic. He didn't like the food in Geneva because he thought that there were too many sauces on the meat. He thought in France you got Béarnaise sauce or you got Bordelaise sauce, but not both at the same time because that's chaotic. So, and then the pastor who was talking to him said, "That's fine. Sorry you don't like Geneva, but it's been revealed to me that it's God's will that you stay here. And if you don't, your life will be cursed." So that was a pretty persuasive argument. And so Calvin stayed, and he helped reform not only the church in Geneva and its theology away from Catholicism, but also the civic government, so that Protestants would have control of the government. And he even helped reform the dress codes. He reformed everything. He decided that the Genevans were too ostentatious, too flamboyant in their clothing, that they were playing one-upsmanship on one another. There was too much conspicuous consumption. So he developed sumptuary laws so that no one in Geneva can wear anything other than wool or cotton or linen. Silk, satin, definitely out. And all the clothing had to be dyed with cheap, inexpensive dyes, which meant brown, gray, black, beige, not expensive dyes like indigo or purple or scarlet. And those laws were passed and they were enforced. The Genevans, however, didn't like that very much because they were making money in trade. Geneva is on the intersection of a bunch of trade routes. So there was money to be had. And some of the Genevans, I know you'll find this hard to believe, were sinful enough to want to show it and display it. So they did want to engage in conspicuous consumption, but they couldn't wear gaudily colored silk or satin garments. But the Genevans, being clever, realized that Calvin's law had not specified underwear. This is going to be the birth of Victoria's Secret. So what they discovered was that they could wear satin, silk, purple, pink, chartreuse undergarments. But of course, if nobody can see it, that defeats the purpose of conspicuous consumption. So what they began to do was slash their clothing so that when they moved, you could see the underwear. And this became a style. It spread from Geneva, actually through all of Europe. It became a fashion. And then Calvin said, well, okay, we have to rewrite the laws. I overlooked something, I overlooked underwear. The Genevans then rebelled at that, said, mess with our underwear. We're not going to stand for it. So at that point, Calvin left Geneva, got out, said, they don't really want me here. I'm out. So he went to Strasbourg in Alsace, settled down for a while. And the pastor of the main Protestant church in Alsace came to him and said, John, you're single. That makes people talk. They think you might be secretly a priest and that you've taken a vow of celibacy. So it looks like you might be Catholic. So would you please get married? And Calvin said, no, I don't want to get married. I want to be a scholar. I want to write theology. That's all I want to do. And a wife and a family would be an encumbrance. Then the pastor said, it's been revealed to me by God that if you do not get married, your life will be cursed. And it's also been revealed to me by God who you should marry. And so Calvin obeyed. Shortly thereafter, some representatives from Geneva came to Strasbourg to see him and said, Geneva has deteriorated and it devolved into chaos ever since you left. So we'd really like you to come back. And this time we'll be more receptive to your suggestions. Calvin said, I'm not going to do that. I had a really bad time in Geneva. The place is chaotic. I don't want to go there. And then they said, it has been revealed to us by God that it is God's will that you return to Geneva. And so he did. And he stayed there for the rest of his life. He helped reform the city, secular government, the church. He wrote theology. He did more than anyone else to forge the Reformed tradition. He never liked it because he always felt ill at ease there. He didn't like the Alps. He didn't like the food. He didn't like the Genevans. But looking back on his life, he concluded that his chaotic existence had prepared him with all the gifts and training that he needed to do exactly this. That he had had theological training, ministerial training, and legal training. And Geneva needed all that. So he thought, I didn't know it at the time because my life seemed like a mess, just seemed like a bundle of accidents and contingencies and chaos. But behind the scenes, God was preparing me for this. Even my father shifting me back and forth from law school to seminary, that was giving me exactly the tools I needed to reform Geneva, exactly what the Genevans wanted. It wasn't my will that I go here. Concluded it was God working behind the scenes. So the point here is that he, in his childhood and adulthood, had an enormous problem with chaos, feeling anxious all the time, that the universe was falling apart, that the wheels were spinning off the bus. Then he finally concluded it only looked that way, because behind it all, God's mysterious will was at work, even in the tragedies, even in the bad things that had happened to him, like the death of his mother, that God's will was at work, achieving God's purposes. So he generalized from that and said, just as God was secretly at work in my life, doing things behind the scenes to get the results God wanted, that's the way God works in the whole universe. It looks like chaos, it feels like chaos, but it's not. There is somebody minding the store who has mysterious purposes that will be achieved, even though we can't see it at the time. We might not even know what those purposes are. So I wanted that little biography of Calvin to suggest that that's why the theology he developed had a strong sense of God is a God of order, not of chaos, and that God controls everything so that God's will be achieved, and things don't happen by accident. Calvinists following him have pushed that to its logical conclusion, saying that, well, God must ordain every single thing that happens. I think I talked about Jonathan Edwards on the choir that collapsed. No? Okay. Well, I think the most extreme example of that happened in New England with the theologian minister Jonathan Edwards in the 18th century, who was both Congregational and Presbyterian, but he was doubly Reformed. He had a church at the foothills of the Berkshires in Western Connecticut, Western Massachusetts, in the Connecticut River Valley. And one day he was preaching, and it was one of these, white clapboard New England churches, Currier and Ives Church, with most of the congregation sitting in the first story, but a choir loft above it that went over most of the congregation, with half the congregation up there in the loft. And while he was preaching, the choir loft collapsed. And half the congregation fell on top of the other half of the congregation. And there were screams and crying and broken bones and lacerations. But being a talented preacher, did he stop? No. You might want to ask any ministerial candidates that you have, if the choir loft collapsed on top of the congregation, what would you do? Because Jonathan Edwards just kept preaching, but he changed the direction of his sermon and used it as an object lesson to talk about the way in which God's will micromanages the universe. So he assured his congregation that every splinter had fallen to the exact place God had ordained that it would fall to before the universe had been created. And that every bone had been broken in exactly the place God had ordained that they would be broken. And that every cut had occurred in exactly the place that God had ordained it would. And then he concluded, therefore, everything is going to according to God's plan. There's nothing to worry about, and stop whining. He was, however, dismissed from that congregation shortly thereafter. I just tell that story about how seriously some people took this theme that God ordains everything, including the salvation and damnation of human beings. Another example of that was during the French and Indian Wars, there were attacks on Presbyterian congregations in the Shenandoah Valley in Virginia, and also in Pennsylvania, to the west of here. One of the churches in Virginia, many of the congregants left diaries behind, was attacked by the French. And what their pastor told them, which most of them recorded, was if it was God's will, they would survive the attack. If it was God's will that they perish, then that also was part of God's plan. Therefore, whether they survived or whether they perished, God's will would prevail and all was well. And that comforted them. Now, if this sounds harsh, be assured that most Presbyterians don't believe anymore in that kind of strict predestination and strict determinism that God ordains everything that happens, including our ultimate destinies. By the 19th century, that was being discarded by most Presbyterian pastors, theologians, and lay people. Ones who still believe it are largely in the PCA now, not this denomination. So there are still Presbyterians who believe it, but they're not united Presbyterians. What has replaced it is the theme that there's something good about that view of election and providence. And it's that in the end, God has a plan and God will win. Presbyterians have always retained that notion, that God is sovereign and God's purposes will be achieved. What's been jettisoned is the notion that in order to achieve God's goals, that God ordains everything that happens. That's largely been jettisoned, particularly the part where God ordains tragedies. That's been jettisoned. It's been replaced by the notion that stuff happens that is not due to God's will. Tragedies occur, but whatever happens, God can work with it. God can change evil into good. Might take a long time, might not happen until all things are made right at the end of time, but somehow or other, God's purposes will be achieved. God will not abandon God's people. God will not abandon the universe. In the end, it will all be well. So Presbyterians have still kept that notion of sovereignty in a way that some other kinds of Christians have not. But what they've changed is that in order for God's purposes to be achieved, that doesn't mean that God micromanages or ordains every event that happens. So that was a little discussion of predestination, election, providence, sovereignty, which many people associate with Presbyterianism. That's, I want to give time for questions and discussion. Let's turn to the doctrine of the church. What is the church? Which, as you're looking for leadership, is probably something of primary concern. Well, for the Lutherans, shifting back to the Lutherans, because they're a good contrast, Luther said that the church exists everywhere that the gospel of the forgiveness of sins is proclaimed, and the sacraments, Lord's Supper, baptism, which also proclaim the forgiveness of sins, are rightly practiced. So Luther said, if you got a bunch of people coming together to hear sermons about the forgiveness of sins, and they have a duly constituted baptism and the Lord's Supper, you got yourself a church. You don't need anything else. Calvin liked that, but he thought there was something missing. So Calvin and the Reformed tradition added a third mark of the church. So it's not just enough to have preaching about forgiveness. It's not just enough to have baptism and the Eucharist rightly administered. You need a third thing. And for him, it was crucial. And that's discipline. You need to have a community of people who are actively helping each other grow in righteousness and grow in holiness and faith, hope, and love. So if you don't, it's not really a church. So Calvin was intent that in the churches in Geneva, that there was a strong body of lay people, namely the elders, who would have responsibility for helping other congregants grow in righteousness, which meant in Geneva and many other times, unfortunately, in the history of Presbyterianism, it meant punishment. So that if you saw any of your neighbors acting up or doing something that was unrighteous, you should confront them. And if they repent and mend their ways, fine. If they don't, then they'd have to be disciplined by the congregation, which could involve their excommunication. That was the job of the elders. And that expanded into the notion that you shouldn't really receive communion if you had been unrighteous. It was part of the duty of the elders to interview everybody in the congregation before communion in order to see if anybody had been sinning so badly that they should be excluded from communion. So that in order to receive communion, you had to prove that you had been interviewed by the elders and that you had passed muster. Now, it happened by the elders giving you what was called a communion token, which looks like a subway token, which you'd have to produce when you went forward for communion. Many of them were dated. They're usually made out of cheap white metal. Some of them had dates on, like I have been examined and for communion on April 6th, 1667. Some of them were not dated, which meant they were kind of like wild cards. In fact, this is still practiced in Ulster, in Northern Ireland. Often, I had an Irish student, North Irish, Scots Irish Presbyterian, at the seminary, who gave me a bag of undated communion tokens, because she thought I might need them. So I just, that practice has fallen into disuse. I don't imagine that the elders here visit people's homes and ask you, what sins have you committed lately? Or go to your neighbors' houses and ask them, what sins have you committed? That in the 19th century, that practice began to fall into disuse and was replaced not so much by punishment. If you're sinning, you're not going to receive communion, and you might get kicked out of the church. But rather by praying for one another, and maybe even giving spiritual direction and pastoral care to one another. So the stick has been replaced by a carrot. It's still the notion that people in a Presbyterian congregation should be concerned about one another's spiritual health. But these days, that usually means prayer, giving care and comfort to the bereaved, maybe confronting people who seem to be endangering their own spirituality by egregiously bad behavior, but usually not excommunication. It still happens sometimes, but that's rare. So the discipline theme has moved away from punitive interventions to nurture, and moving right along. The sacraments. And again, in Presbyterianism, the focus has to be on what does God do? What does God do in baptism and the Lord's Supper? Not on what do we do. It's about God's power, not ours. So that's why Presbyterians do not practice adult baptism. Well, if somebody wants to convert who hadn't been baptized, that's fine. But Presbyterians prefer infant baptism because adult baptism is based on the notion that baptism is a commitment by the individual to God, where the agency is the individual. You say, I pledge myself to follow Jesus, or I pledge myself to turn away from the ways of sin, death, and the devil, which means you're doing it. The action's yours. By the way, I was raised Baptist, and I remember when I was 12 and deemed to be at the age of reason, where I was mature enough to take a responsibility for the future direction of my spiritual life, that I was asked by the pastor, okay, it's time for you to get baptized. Just got to ask you a few simple questions. Don't worry, everybody answers these in the affirmative. But I was kind of a religiously serious kid. I said, well, can you tell me what the questions are going to be? They said, yeah, are you willing to renounce the ways of sin, death, and the devil? And so I said, now, the sin part. Could you be more specific? Yeah, so he enumerated a bunch of things that I was renouncing. I said, some of those things I haven't tried. Yeah, and some of them, I don't even know what they are. Yeah. So I don't think at this time I'm prepared to renounce them. So I didn't get baptized then. I didn't get baptized until college. But that's what Presbyterians don't like, the notion that in baptism, you're making a promise to God. You say, it's the other way around. God's making a promise to you. But in baptism, the agency is God's. God is promising to nurture this child in the faith. God is promising through the community, through the parents, to accept this person into the family of God. And that's God's action. It's God's decision. It's not the baby's. God's grace is the thing that should be focused on rather than any human response. And the same thing's true of the Lord's Supper. Some traditions, like the Baptists, and even some Presbyterians, tend to think of the Lord's Supper as a memorial meal, that it reminds us of Jesus. It reminds us of Jesus' life, death, and resurrection, and that should have an impact upon us. If that's true, then the power of the Lord's Supper resides in the power of your ability to imagine the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus. Because can you focus on the Lord's Supper sufficiently that Jesus has an impact on your soul? So there, the agency is yours. But Calvin and most Presbyterians have said, no, it's the other way around. In the Lord's Supper, Christ reaches out to us, whether we're trying to remember Christ or focus on Christ or not. The agency is Christ. Christ becomes present to us through the celebration of the Lord's Supper. And then there's always a but not present through the bread and the wine themselves. Rather, Christ is present through the performance of the ritual, spiritually. It's our spirit feasting on the Spirit of Christ. It's not like Christ is living in the bread and the wine, which was feared as a kind of idolatrous, superstitious thing that both Catholics and Lutherans believe. Because Lutherans do believe that Christ is present in, with, and under the bread and the wine. And of course, so do Catholics. I'm just having an unfortunate flashback. In 1997, backstory, prior to that, Lutherans and Presbyterians and other Reformed people had excommunicated one another on this issue, largely. Do you believe that Christ is spiritually present? That's Presbyterians. Or do you believe that Christ is physically present? That's Lutherans. Both had excommunicated one another, anathematized one another in the late 16th century. And those anathemas had stayed on the books until 1997, when finally they were lifted. And Reformed Christians, including Presbyterians and Lutherans, were allowed to participate in one another's celebration of the Lord's Supper. And ministers from the other denomination could officiate. So it took until 1997 for this to change. The United Church of Christ, my own denomination, which is also Reformed, was part of those talks. Locally, the thing that was called the Formula of Agreement, where for the first time, Lutherans, UCC, and Presbyterians could celebrate communion together, was held near here. I'll change all the names to protect the innocent. But in a town where there had, from colonial times on, there had been a Lutheran church and a Presbyterian church. A United Church of Christ, which was at that time German Reformed. They had never been able to celebrate communion together, even though they shared the same cemetery and often intermarried. So this was a big deal. So they decided to have a joint communion service. They decided to have it in the Lutheran church with the 18th century Lutheran communion utensils. But they decided that the Reformed pastor was going to say the words of institution and be the main celebrant. Big mistake. The Reformed pastor hadn't seen the Lutheran communion utensils, including a 18th century pewter ewer that looked like a tankard, looked like a beer stein, from which the wine would be poured. But the Reformed pastor had seen Lutherans very dramatically pour the wine from way up high into a goblet. So he decided that's what he was going to do. He didn't check the tankard. It wasn't a tankard because the lid was not secured. It wasn't on a hinge like a beer stein. It was just loose. So he did this thing. Yeah, you see what's coming.
Yeah.
And as he got up there, the lid came off, splashed down into the goblet, knocked the goblet over, and the wine started to spill over the table onto the floor. At which time, the Lutheran pastor, who believed that Christ is in, with, and under the bread and the wine, got down on his knees, started to catch the wine with a napkin, and when that got saturated, started to lick it up with his tongue. And at which point, the Reformed pastor, who was mic'd, actually said, "Cut that out, that's weird." And I thought, well, this symbolizes the difference between Reformed and Lutherans on the bread and the wine, and this is also going to set back ecumenism for a couple of centuries. But anyway, the thing about Reformed view of the Lord's Supper is Christ is present and takes the initiative to transform our souls and nurture us with his own spirit, but it's not in the bread and the wine. Okay, I want to leave time for observations and questions. So actually, I'll stop there with the final, at the conclusion that down the line, Presbyterians like to focus on God, God's glory, God's power, God's saving grace. They also have historically thought of humans as being very sinful. But the final note is that God's grace is more powerful than human sinfulness. And therefore, God's love is trustworthy and will be victorious. So what I'd like to do now is throw this open for some conversation for the next 5-10 minutes.
I just have a quick question.
Sure.
Do you have a recommendation for a biography of Calvin?
Yeah, there's one by a British theologian named Alistair McGrath. It's pretty readable.
Thank you.
Yeah. Is this all right? Why do bad things happen? Oh, why do bad things happen? Yeah.
Why do bad things happen?
Yeah, well, for the older Reformed tradition, it was bad things happen because it's God's will. And that somehow God brings the bad things are part of God's mysterious plan. And we don't know what that plan is. So that was the old view. The newer view is more skeptical. We don't really know why bad things happen. But what we do know is that whatever happens, God can work good out of it. Maybe not in this life, but in the next.
Now, I grew up in one of those houses where there were mixed messages with communion because my mother was born and raised a Catholic, and my dad was born and raised a Methodist. And although I was baptized a Methodist, I was confirmed an Episcopalian. So the Episcopalian religion was very similar to the Lutherans. As a matter of fact, we used to swap services once a year. And I remember when my brother and I were acolytes in the Episcopal service, that when communion was being served, we used to have wafers as the symbol for the bread. And I can remember my mother always teaching us that if by chance my brother and I were serving the communion wafers while the minister would be serving wine afterwards, if those wafers touched the ground, if they fell off of the platter, that was that God was in that wafer, and that the minister was the only one that could pick that up. And if by chance half a dozen wafers fell at one time, or the whole platter fell over, that the minister would actually consume all of those at one time because they had already been blessed. Does that sound similar to what you would have heard?
That Lutherans do have a tradition of showing reverence to the elements, to the bread, the wine, or the wafers, and Catholics certainly even more so. They're slightly different in that Lutherans believe that it's only the bread, the body and blood of Christ during the communion service. And then it reverts to just being bread and wine. Catholics believe that no, it stays the body and blood of Christ no matter what, which is why priests have to either reserve the wafers, put them in a sacred receptacle called a monstrance, and in regard to the wine, drink it all. Yeah.
Versus return it to the ground, right? Which is what a Lutheran will return it to the ground,
exactly.
Whereas ours ends up in the sink here.
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
But I mean, the simple way I've heard it described in terms of transubstantiation versus the way we are. Yeah. No problem. The difference I've heard described with transubstantiation versus the way it is that we represent it and the Catholics represent it. Sort of a play on the same words.
Right. Yeah.
So just one kind of quick observation, though, that I thought was interesting. And you were talking about Calvin from the perspective of his biography and sort of his retrospective look back on himself as if it was preordained that way. Theologically speaking, he does the same thing.
Okay.
He looks back on what he wrote and often talks about it later as if softens his view of providence. Anyway, kind of a parallel to his theology imitated his life.
Right. And looking back on his life, his main conclusion was, I thought everything was happening by accident, or my father was just a jerk, but God was pulling all the strings behind the scenes and everything was happening for a reason. Now that's an older Presbyterian view. It's no longer very common. But what survives is the notion, in the end, God will prevail and God's will indeed be victorious. So I think the core of Reformed theology and Presbyterianism can reduce to one thing. It's God's God and you're not. And in the final analysis, it's all about God. The praise of God, the honoring of God's will in the world, the desire to do God's will in the world, the expectation that God's grace will prevail, the kind of cosmic optimism that no matter what happens, God's going to win. It's all about God. So if you had a candidate for ministries and you asked them, what do you think about God? And the candidate said, right now in world history, I think God's having a real struggle. God's having a bad time. And I'm not sure that God's purposes are going to be achieved. We might just blow ourselves up. Global warming might put an end to everything. And then it'll just be over and I'll be very depressed. That's not a good Presbyterian pastor.
Where do the Episcopalians stand on the meaning of communion?
The meaning of communion?
Or not the meaning of communion, on what the bread and wine are.
Yeah. Let's see, there are no current Episcopalians here. They're deliberately slippery.
Yeah,
They like to pride themselves on having a lot of latitude in your understanding of what happens in communion. Sometimes they sound very reformed. There's a real spiritual presence. Sometimes they seem to be a little more Catholic or Lutheran and honor and venerate the elements. And they'll tolerate either view. For an Episcopalian, the basic rule of thumb is, don't really care what you believe about it. Just do what the Book of Common Prayer says. Just worship in the way that's stipulated, say the prayers, and you're good. Just they sound like good politicians. And they were, because the Episcopalianism arose as though it was intended to be the religion of England. There were different theological opinions in England. And so the strategy was, let's not be too specific, so that different kinds of Christians can read their own theology into what we do and say. So they're trying to be broad, and like a politician, that often involves being vague. Okay. Just remember, God's God, you're not. Oh, yeah. God, we do trust that you are a sovereign God of majesty and might, whose will somehow or other will prevail. Be with this congregation as it wrestles with the question of new congregational leadership. Send your Holy Spirit to illumine their minds and inflame their hearts, so that your will for this congregation, for this broader community, for the church and the world will prevail. Amen.
Man.
Thank you so much.